I'm 71 years old now. For nearly 50 years, I've kept a secret that sits in my chest like a stone. My name is Robert Callahan, and I spent 40 years as a commercial fisherman working the waters off the coast of Maine. I caught cod, haddock, and halibut. I repaired nets, maintained engines, and filed tax returns. It was hard work, but it paid my mortgage and put my two daughters through college. To anyone who knew me, I was ordinary. A quiet man who preferred the solitude of open water to the noise of harbor towns. But since August 1974, I've carried knowledge that doesn't fit into that ordinary life. I've seen things in the North Atlantic that science says don't exist. I've communicated with beings that have no place in our understanding of marine biology. And I've learned truths about why they hide from us that have made me question everything I thought I knew about humanity's place in this world. I never wanted to tell this story. For decades, I convinced myself that keeping silent was the responsible choice. Who would believe me? What good would it do? But 6 months ago, my doctor found a mass in my pancreas, stage 4. They gave me a year, maybe less. And I realized that dying with this knowledge felt wrong. Not because I need anyone to believe me, but because somewhere in the deep ocean, they're still out there, still watching us, still hoping we might prove them wrong about what kind of species we are. This is what happened. This is what I know. August 12, 1974. I was 24 years old, working my third season on a 42-foot trawler called the Mary Catherine. I'd bought her the year before with money I'd saved working on other men's boats since I was 16. She wasn't much to look at, rust showing through the paint along her hull, but her engine was solid, and she handled well in rough seas. The previous owner, a man named Ed Kowalski, who'd retired after 40 years fishing these waters, had maintained her mechanically, even if he'd let the cosmetics go. That morning, I'd left Portland Harbor at 4 a.m., heading for a spot about 60 miles offshore, where I'd had good luck with cod the previous week. The weather forecast called for light winds and calm seas. By 5:30 a.m., I was on location, alone on the water, the nearest vessel at least 10 miles away, according to my radar. The isolation was normal. Most fishermen in those days worked alone or with one crew member. I preferred working solo. It meant smaller catches, but it also meant I didn't have to split the profits or deal with the complications that came with crew. I started hauling my nets around 6. The sun was just breaking the horizon, turning the water from black to gray, to that particular shade of deep blue you only see far from shore. The air was cool, maybe 58 degrees, and the sea was flat enough that I could see my reflection in the water between the swells. I'd been pulling nets for 2 hours when I saw something surface about 30 yards off the starboard side. At first, I thought it was a seal. We saw them often enough in those waters, particularly harbor seals and the occasional gray seal. But seals don't stay still like that. This one was just floating there, and as I cut the engine to get a better look, I realized the shape was wrong. Too vertical, too much above the waterline. A seal would have been horizontal in the water, not upright. I grabbed my binoculars, the heavy Bushnell pair I'd bought my second year fishing. The figure was about 20 feet away now, drifting closer with the current. Dark hair, pale shoulders, arms moving slowly in the water. A swimmer, had to be. Someone must have fallen overboard from a vessel I hadn't seen on radar. It happened sometimes. Fishermen lost overboard in the night, tourists falling from pleasure boats, accidents that ended with bodies found days later. I moved to the rail, calling out, "Hey, are you hurt? Can you hear me?" The figure turned toward me. That's when I saw the face clearly for the first time. Human features, eyes, nose, mouth, but the eyes were larger than they should have been, set wider apart, and there was something about the proportions that wasn't quite right. The nose was flatter, the mouth wider, and the way she moved in the water, staying upright without treading water, without any visible effort to stay afloat. No one could do that, not without assistance. I leaned over the rail. "I'm coming to get you. Hold on. I started the engine, bringing the Mary Catherine around slowly so I wouldn't run over her. As I got closer, she didn't swim away. She didn't panic or call for help. She just watched me. I could see her clearly now, maybe 15 feet away. Her skin was pale but had a faint gray-blue tint I'd never seen on a person before. Her hair was black and thick, floating around her shoulders in a way that seemed wrong. Hair in water usually clings together, plasters itself to the head. Hers moved independently, each strand separate. I cut the engine. We were close, enough now that I could see the details. Her shoulders were narrow but muscular. Her arms, when she lifted them slightly, showed webbing between her fingers. Not like a glove, but natural. Skin stretched between the digits from knuckle to fingertip. Her neck was longer than it should have been, giving her head that vertical posture in the water. And then she dove. Not like a person diving, but like a seal or dolphin. One smooth motion, her body arcing, and where legs should have been, I saw something else, a tail. Gray-blue, maybe 4 or 5 feet long, moving in the water with powerful horizontal movements. The last thing I saw before she disappeared was the tail flukes, horizontal like a whale's, catching the light as they slipped beneath the surface. I stood at the rail for a long time after she disappeared. My hands were shaking. I could hear my own breathing, too fast, too shallow. The rational part of my brain was trying to explain what I'd seen, a costume, a hoax, someone in an elaborate suit playing a prank. But the way she'd moved, the speed and fluidity of that dive, the complete lack of fear or surprise in her eyes when she looked at me. None of it fit with a person in a costume. I remember thinking I should radio the Coast Guard, but what would I say? I saw a woman with a tail? They'd think I'd been drinking or worse. And what if it wasn't a hoax? What if what I'd seen was real? Then calling anyone meant bringing attention to something that had clearly been hiding from human notice for a long time. I didn't haul any more nets that day. I just sat in the wheelhouse, staring at the spot where she'd gone under. The water was calm, undisturbed, no bubbles, no disturbance of the surface. She'd gone deep. After an hour, I started the engine and headed back to port. The trip back took 3 hours. I spent it trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Sleep deprivation, exhaustion, maybe a combination of sun glare and wishful thinking, though I couldn't explain what I'd been wishing for. By the time I tied up at the dock, I'd almost convinced myself I'd been mistaken. But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about her eyes. They'd looked at me with recognition, not the blank stare of a fish or the wariness of a seal. She'd understood that I was there, that I was looking at her, and she'd made a choice to stay long enough for me to see what she was before she left. That wasn't animal behavior, that was intelligence, curiosity, maybe even communication. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen, not my wife Sarah, who I'd married 2 years earlier, not the other fishermen I drank with at Murphy's Tavern on Friday nights, not Ed Kowalski when he stopped by the dock to see how his old boat was running. I filed it away as something I didn't understand and tried to forget about it, but I couldn't forget her eyes. I didn't go back to that spot for 3 weeks. I fished other areas, worked closer to shore, told myself I didn't want to see whatever I'd seen again. But the truth was more complicated. Part of me was afraid of confirming what I'd witnessed. As long as I stayed away, I could maintain the possibility that I'd been wrong, that it had been something explainable. Going back meant facing the reality of what existed in those waters. But on September 4th, 1974, I needed a good catch. I'd had 2 weeks of poor hauls, and I had payments to make. The Mary Catherine's engine needed work, my wife Sarah was pregnant with our first daughter, and the money I'd saved was running low. So I went back to the coordinates I'd marked in my log from that first day, the place where I'd seen her. I set my nets at dawn and worked through the morning. The weather was rougher than it had been in August. A front was moving in, bringing wind and chop to the water. By 10 a.m., the swells were running 4 to 5 feet, making the work harder. I was pulling in the third net when I felt unusual resistance. Something big was caught. My first thought was shark. We'd occasionally catch blues and makos in these waters. I worked the winch slowly, bringing the net up. The weight was distributed wrong for a shark. Too much resistance, too little movement. As the net broke the surface, I saw her, tangled in the mesh, barely moving. The same gray-blue skin, the same dark hair, but this time I could see all of her clearly. No ambiguity, no chance for misidentification. Her upper body was human in proportion. Shoulders, arms, torso, all recognizable. But below the waist, where legs should have ended, there was a tail. Maybe 5 feet long, muscular, covered in scales that caught the light even under the gray sky. The tail was wrapped tightly in the net mesh, constricting her movement. Her arms were tangled too, pulled back in a position that looked painful. She was dying. I could see it in the way she hung in the net, in the shallow movement of her chest. Her eyes were half closed. The net had wrapped around her tail and upper body, cutting into her skin in several places, blood mixed with seawater, dark streaks running down her pale skin. She'd been struggling, I realized, fighting to free herself until exhaustion took over. I should have cut the net loose and let her sink. That would have been the safe choice, the smart choice. Whatever she was dying, and involving myself meant taking responsibility for something I didn't understand. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't just watch her die. I grabbed my filleting knife, the one with the serrated edge that I used for cutting heavy line, and started working on the net. Commercial-grade nylon is designed to hold thousands of pounds of fish. It doesn't cut easily. I had to saw through each strand, and there were dozens of them wrapped around her body. The boat was rocking in the swells, making it hard to keep my balance while I worked. She didn't struggle. She just watched me through half-closed eyes, her breathing getting slower. I talked to her while I cut, though I don't know if she understood. "Hold on, almost there, just a few more." Maybe I was talking to myself, maintaining some kind of normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. It took me 15 minutes to free her enough that she could move her arms. I cut the net away from her torso first, then worked on her tail. The scales were harder than I expected, and the knife kept catching on them. In several places, the net had cut deep enough to draw blood. I poured seawater over the wounds, trying to clean them, though I had no idea if that would help or hurt. When I finally got the last section of net off her, she slid into the water with a splash. The net I'd cut away drifted alongside the boat, useless now. That net had cost me $200. For a moment, I thought she was going to sink, and that would be the end of it. I'd saved her from the net only to watch her die anyway. But she surfaced a few feet from the boat, her head just above water, taking deep, gasping breaths. Her chest heaved. Her eyes opened wider. She looked at me, and I saw panic there, not the calm observation from our first encounter. This was fear and pain and confusion. I don't know why I did what I did next. Maybe it was the look in her eyes. Maybe it was some instinct I didn't know I had. I stripped off my shirt and boots, tied a rope around my waist, secured the other end to a cleat on the deck, and went in after her. The water was cold, not the hypothermic cold of winter, but cold enough that I felt it immediately, maybe 55 degrees. I swam over to her and got my arm under her shoulders, keeping her head above water. She flinched at the contact, tried to pull away, but she was too weak. I held her gently, talking to her in the same tone I'd used while cutting the net. "It's okay, I've got you. Just breathe." She was heavier than I expected. Her tail alone must have weighed 80 pounds, and it was dead weight, not helping keep her afloat. I had to work to keep both our heads above water, using the rope to stay connected to the boat. The swells made it harder. Every few minutes a larger wave would wash over us, and I'd have to hold my breath and grip her tighter. We stayed like that for almost 2 hours. I held her up, and she breathed. My arms went numb from the cold and the effort. My legs cramped from treading water. But slowly, her color improved. The grayish tint that I'd associated with her dying faded to something healthier, more like the blue-gray I'd seen in that first encounter. Her breathing deepened and steadied. The panic left her eyes, replaced by something else: awareness, focus. She started making sounds, not words, but vocalizations, low notes that I felt as much as heard, resonating in my chest cavity. They had a rhythm to them, a pattern. She'd make a sound, pause, make another sound, pause. It felt deliberate, communicative. I had nothing to respond with, so I just kept holding her, keeping her head above water. Around noon she moved. Her tail flexed, and she pulled away from me gently. She swam in a circle, testing her strength, then came back. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she did something I still can't fully explain. She reached out and touched my hand where it was holding the rope. Her fingers were webbed between the knuckles, and her skin felt cool and smooth. She held my hand for maybe 5 seconds, making another sound, different from the others, softer. Then she dove. I watched her shape descend into the dark water until I couldn't see her anymore. I climbed back onto the Mary Catherine, shivering from cold and something else I couldn't name. I pulled in my remaining nets, started the engine, and pointed the boat toward shore. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way she'd looked at me while I cut the net away, the way she'd touched my hand. I'd saved her life, and she'd known it. There had been gratitude in that gesture, awareness, intelligence. I was back at the same location the next morning. I told myself I was going there to fish, but I didn't set any nets. I just drifted, engine off, waiting. I didn't know if she would come back. I didn't know if she could find me again in 60 miles of open ocean. But something in the way she'd touched my hand made me think she would try. She surfaced at 7:15 a.m., about 10 yards from the boat, just her head and shoulders above water, watching me. I stood at the rail and raised my hand. She made a sound, that low, resonant note I'd heard the day before, and swam closer. For the next hour, we just looked at each other. I didn't try to touch her, and she kept her distance, but she didn't leave. She circled the boat slowly, diving occasionally and resurfacing in different spots. I noticed details I'd missed before. Her hands were smaller than human hands, with longer fingers. Her hair wasn't just floating in the water. It seemed to move on its own, independent of the current. And her eyes, those large eyes, tracked me wherever I moved on the deck. Around 8:30, I had an idea. I went into the cabin and found my waterproof notebook, the one I used for logging catches and coordinates. I came back to the rail and held it up, then opened it and showed her the blank page. She tilted her head, curious. I pulled out a pencil and drew a simple shape, a fish. She made a different sound, higher pitched. I couldn't tell if it was amusement or curiosity. I drew another fish, then pointed at her. She watched. Then I drew a stick figure of a person and pointed at myself. She dove. I thought I'd scared her off, but 30 seconds later, she surfaced holding something, a piece of kelp. She held it up, then let it fall back into the water. Then she pointed at herself and made a sound, a specific sound, 3 notes in sequence. I understood. She was telling me her name, or at least the sound she wanted me to associate with her. I tried to repeat it. I got it wrong the first time. She made the sound again, slower. I tried again, closer. She made another sound that might have been approval. That became our routine. Every morning for the next week, I went to the same coordinates, and she was there. We spent hours together. I brought different things to show her. Pictures from magazines, tools, a compass that fascinated her. She touched it carefully with her webbed fingers, feeling the glass, watching the needle swing. I tried to teach her gestures, thumbs up for yes, thumbs down for no. She learned quickly. Within 3 days, she was using them correctly. I drew pictures in my notebook trying to communicate basic concepts: water, sky, boat, food. She watched everything I did with intense focus. By the end of September, she was bringing things to show me, shells I'd never seen before, pieces of coral from depths I couldn't reach. Once, she brought up a brass compass, old enough that the markings were in a language I didn't recognize. She'd found it on the ocean floor. She seemed to indicate through gestures and kept it because it reminded her of mine. I started bringing food, not fish, she had plenty of that, but bread, which she tried and rejected, apples, which she ate cautiously. I brought a thermos of soup once, and she tasted it and made a sound I interpreted as disgust. I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in her presence, and she stopped, studying my face as I did it. Then she made a sound that might have been her version of laughter. I couldn't be sure. The communications were simple at first. Yes, no, up, down, danger, food, come closer, stay back. But each week, we understood more. She learned to recognize the sound of my boat's engine and would surface when she heard it. I learned that when she made a particular high-pitched sound, it meant she was about to dive deep and wouldn't be back for a while. By November, when the weather started to turn and I couldn't get out to the fishing grounds as often, I'd learned she wasn't alone. Twice I saw others in the distance. They never came close, but I could see them watching. Once I counted 5 of them, their heads just visible above the surface, staying perhaps 100 yards away. She made sounds toward them, and they answered. A conversation I couldn't understand. When I did get back out to see her, after a storm had kept me in port for 5 days, she seemed agitated. She kept making a particular sound, urgent and repetitive, and pointing down into the water. I didn't understand what she was trying to tell me. She tried showing me through gestures, but I couldn't grasp it. Finally, she dove and stayed down for so long, I thought she'd left. But she came back up with something. A piece of metal, rusted, but still recognizable, part of a ship's railing. She held it up, then pointed down again, then made the urgent sound again. I understood then. There was something down there she wanted me to see, something she thought was important. I didn't have diving equipment that could reach the depths she was indicating. The best I had was a snorkel and mask for checking the hull. I showed her these, tried to explain the limitation. She seemed frustrated. She took the mask from me, examined it, then dove with it. When she came back, she'd tied a piece of kelp to it and made gestures I interpreted as, "This isn't enough. You need more." Winter came, and I couldn't get out to see her for weeks at a time. But every time the weather cleared enough, I went. And she was always there waiting. We'd spend whatever time we had communicating in our improvised language, and then I'd have to leave before the next storm system rolled in. By the spring of 1975, I'd filled 3 notebooks with observations. I'd drawn diagrams of her physical features, written phonetic approximations of the sound she made, documented every object she'd shown me. I'd turned into an amateur ethnographer, studying a species that wasn't supposed to exist. The sounds she made carried specific meanings. I'd confirmed at least 12 distinct vocalizations by March. There was a low, resonant note that meant greeting, a higher pitch that indicated danger, a rapid series of clicks that seemed to express curiosity, a descending tone that I associated with sadness or regret, and dozens of others I was still trying to understand. She was patient with me. When I got something wrong, she'd repeat the sound or gesture until I understood. When I got it right, she'd make a particular chirping sound that I'd come to recognize as approval or encouragement. In April, something changed. She brought another one with her, a male, larger than her, with darker skin, and a tail that was more blue than gray. He stayed back, maybe 30 feet, watching us interact. She made sounds toward him, and he responded. Then she gestured for me to show him what I'd shown her. I held up my notebook. I drew simple pictures. I demonstrated the yes-no gestures. The male watched, but didn't come closer. After about 20 minutes, he dove and didn't resurface. She made a sound toward where he'd disappeared, then turned back to me and made the approval sound. I'd been tested, I realized, and apparently I'd passed. Over the next month, she brought 3 more of them. Each time they kept their distance while she demonstrated our communication system. Each time they watched me carefully before leaving. I understood what was happening. She was showing them that I could be trusted, that I wasn't a threat, that communication was possible. In May, all 4 of them came at once. They stayed further back, maybe 50 yards, but they stayed. I could see them clearly through my binoculars. 2 males, 2 females, different skin tones, different sizes. One of the females was smaller, younger maybe, and she kept making sounds that the others seemed to respond to with patience. I stood at the rail and raised my hand, the greeting gesture I'd established with the first one. They watched. Then, one by one, they raised their hands in response. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. They'd accepted the communication. They'd acknowledged me. The one I'd first met, the one whose life I'd saved, swam closer to the boat. She made a complex series of sounds, then pointed at herself, then at the others, then at me. I understood the meaning, not individuals, group, family, pod. Whatever word fit, she was telling me they were connected. She pointed at the water, made a sweeping gesture with her arm, then pointed down. Depth. She made the urgent sound again, the one she'd made when trying to show me something below. Then she did something new. She took my hand, pressed it flat, and with her other hand made a walking motion with 2 fingers across my palm. Then she pointed at the others and made the same walking motion. I stared at her, trying to understand. Walking. She was showing me walking. She pointed at me, made the walking gesture, then pointed at the others and made it again. Then she made a sound that seemed questioning, ended on an up note. Did we walk? I didn't understand the question. Of course, humans walked. Then I got it. She wasn't asking if I walked. She was asking if they had walked, if her people had walked on land. I nodded. Yes, it was a guess, but it felt right. She made a long descending sound, sad. Then she pointed down into the water again, made the walking gesture, and then drew her finger across her throat. The universal sign for death. They had walked once. Something had happened. They'd gone into the water, and something about that history was down below, in the depths where I couldn't reach. I spent the next 2 weeks trying to figure out how to get underwater. I looked into dive equipment, but commercial diving gear cost more than I had, and I'd need training I didn't have time for. I couldn't tell anyone why I needed it. I couldn't explain what I was trying to reach. When I went back out in June, she was waiting with something. A rope. Not modern nylon, but something woven from plant fibers, kelp maybe, incredibly strong. She tied one end to the rail of my boat, then took the other end and dove. She came back a minute later and gestured for me to pull. I pulled. The rope was attached to something heavy. It took me 5 minutes to haul it up. When it broke the surface, I saw what she'd brought me. A stone, carved stone, maybe 2 feet across, covered in symbols I didn't recognize. Not letters, but deliberate markings. She watched me examine it, then pointed at herself, then at the stone, then down into the water. There was more down there, much more. She wanted me to understand that her people had made things, built things, had civilization. I held the stone carefully, tracing the carvings with my finger. She made a sound, soft and sad, and I realized I was holding a piece of her history. She came closer and touched the stone, running her webbed fingers over the carvings. Then she looked at me and made a sound I'd never heard before, complex, layered, lasting maybe 10 seconds. When she finished, the others, still keeping their distance, made the same sound. It echoed across the water, a chorus. I didn't know what it meant, but I felt the weight of it, the seriousness. She'd shown me something important, and now I was part of something I didn't fully understand. I was being trusted with knowledge that her people had kept hidden for however long they'd existed in these waters. She dove and brought up more objects over the next hour, pieces of pottery, a metal tool corroded beyond recognition, more carved stones. Each time she handled them with care, showing me before placing them back in the water. They were too heavy, too numerous for me to keep on the boat. This was her museum, her history, preserved in the cold, dark water. As the sun started to set, she made a sound, and the others began to leave, one by one, until it was just us again. She floated near the boat, and I leaned over the rail. She reached up and touched my hand again, that same gesture from the first day I'd freed her from the net. Then she made a sound I'd come to understand as gratitude. I watched her swim away, her tail moving smoothly through the darkening water. I secured the carved stone in my cabin, wrapped in a tarp, and started the engine. On the way back to port, I tried to process what I'd learned. They had history, they had culture, they had language and family and memory. And they'd been living here, in these waters, hiding from us for reasons I was only beginning to understand. The summer of 1976 brought changes. My daughter Emma was almost 2 years old, and Sarah was pregnant with our second. Money was tighter. I'd taken on debt to repair the Mary Catherine's transmission, and the fishing had been unpredictable. I was going out 5 days a week, sometimes 6, trying to make quota. But I still made time to visit the coordinates where she waited, usually once a week, sometimes twice if the weather held. Our communication had improved to the point where I could understand basic concepts. She could indicate depth, direction, danger, food. I could ask simple questions through gestures and get responses I could interpret with maybe 70% accuracy. In July, she brought something new, a shell, but not like any shell I'd seen in North Atlantic waters. It was spiral-shaped, maybe 6 inches long, with colors that shifted in the light: purple, green, blue. She held it up for me to see, then pointed down into the water. Then she made a gesture I'd come to understand meant many, or more. There were more of these shells below. I'd been thinking about diving equipment for months. The problem was cost and training. Scuba gear ran several $1,000s, and I'd need certification. But I'd found a compromise. A friend who did salvage work had an old hookah rig he was willing to sell cheap. Surface-supplied air through a hose, no tanks needed. It would let me go down maybe 40 feet safely. Not deep, but deeper than I could free dive. I brought the rig out on July 18, 1976. It took me an hour to set it up, running the compressor, testing the regulator, making sure the hose had no leaks. When she surfaced and saw what I was doing, she made sounds I hadn't heard before. Excited sounds. She understood what the equipment meant. I could go down. I went in slowly, testing the gear, adjusting to breathing through the regulator. The water was clearer than usual, visibility maybe 30 feet. She dove ahead of me, her tail moving in smooth, powerful strokes. I followed, descending along the anchor line I'd set. At 20 feet, the light started to dim. At 30 feet, I could see the bottom, and I stopped, holding onto the anchor line, staring. Ruins. Not natural rock formations, structures, walls made of fitted stones, partly collapsed but still recognizable. What looked like the foundation of a building, maybe 30 feet on each side. Carved pillars lying on their sides, covered in marine growth, but still showing deliberate shape and design. She swam down to one of the pillars and ran her hand along it, then looked up at me. This was what she'd been trying to show me for months. This was her history. I descended further, using the anchor line for reference. The ruins covered an area larger than I could see in the limited visibility. Multiple structures connected by what might have been pathways or streets. Everything was covered in algae and barnacles colonized by sea life, but underneath the growth, I could see the work of intelligent design. Corners that met at right angles, archways that had once supported roofs, walls built from stones that had been shaped to fit together. I stayed down for 20 minutes, swimming slowly through the ruins, documenting everything I could see. She stayed close, pointing out details, touching structures as if remembering them. Near one collapsed wall, I found pottery shards. The pieces were thick, well fired, with decorations carved into the clay before firing. I picked up one piece, maybe 4 inches across, and held it in my hand. It was real, solid, evidence of craft and culture. When my air started running low, I ascended slowly, following the protocol I'd learned. She surfaced beside me. I climbed back onto the Mary Catherine, removed my gear, and sat on the deck, trying to process what I'd seen. She floated near the boat, watching me. I held up the pottery shard. She made a soft sound, acknowledging it. Then I pointed down and made a questioning gesture. How old? She couldn't answer that directly. We didn't have the language for it. But she made a gesture I interpreted as very long time. She touched her chest, then pointed down at the ruins, then pointed at the water around us. Her people had lived there once, on land or in shallow water, and now they lived in the deep ocean. Over the next month, I dove the ruins 6 more times. Each time I found more evidence of civilization. Tools made from stone and shell, more pottery, some pieces still intact. Metal objects so corroded I couldn't identify their original purpose. And everywhere the carved stones, some with symbols that looked like writing, others with decorations that might have been art or might have been functional. I kept one piece, a carved stone about the size of my fist, covered in symbols I couldn't read. She'd given it to me, placing it in my hand during one dive. When I tried to return it, she'd pushed my hand away. Keep it, she seemed to say. Remember. The ruins raised more questions than they answered. How old were they? How had they ended up underwater? Had her people built them before retreating to the ocean? Or had something forced them into the water? I tried asking through our limited communication system, but the concepts were too complex. All I understood was that this place was important to her, and sharing it with me meant something. In August, she brought others to the site, 3 of them, including the male I'd seen before. They didn't approach me, but they watched me dive. They saw me examine the ruins, handle the artifacts carefully, return most of them to their places. After my 3rd dive that day, when I surfaced, they were closer, maybe 20 feet away instead of 50. The male made a sound, complex and layered. The others responded. Then she made a sound, and they all went silent. She swam closer to the boat, looked at me, and made a gesture. She touched her chest, then pointed at the others, then pointed at me. Then she made a circling motion with her hand. Together, all of us together. I understood. I'd been accepted, not just by her, but by her group. I'd proven I could be trusted with their history. I wouldn't take it, wouldn't destroy it, wouldn't tell others about it. I was being allowed into something that humans had never been part of. It took 3 more years before I understood what she'd really been trying to tell me. 3 years of weekly meetings, of gradual improvement in our communication, of building vocabulary through repeated gestures and sounds and drawings in my waterproof notebook. By 1979, we could convey fairly complex ideas, not conversations, but exchanges of information that went beyond simple concepts. I'd learned that their vocalizations were more sophisticated than I'd initially thought. Different pitches meant different things, and combinations of sounds created new meanings. I couldn't reproduce most of them. My vocal anatomy wasn't built for it, but I could recognize them and understand their general meaning. In May of 1979, she brought something new to show me, drawings. She'd carved them into a flat piece of slate, using something sharp. The images were crude but recognizable, human figures, boats, and her people, depicted with their distinctive tales. She pointed at the human figures first. Then she made a sound I'd learned meant hunt or kill. She pointed at her people in the drawing. Then she made a gesture, drawing her finger across her throat. I understood the basic meaning. Humans had hunted her people. That wasn't surprising. Humans hunted everything. But she wasn't done. She pulled out another piece of slate, more drawings, human figures again, but these were fighting each other, weapons in their hands, bodies on the ground. She made the same sound, hunt, kill. Then she pointed at the human figures, then at herself, then back at the humans. She was drawing a parallel. Humans killed her people. Humans killed humans. She had more slates. She'd spent time preparing this. The next drawing showed what looked like buildings on fire, humans with torches. The next showed forests being cut down, trees falling. The next showed what I interpreted as nets full of fish. So many fish that the net was breaking. I started to understand what she was showing me. Not just a history of violence against her people, but a pattern. Humans destroyed. Things. We killed our own kind. We burned our own buildings. We harvested until nothing was left. She pulled out one more slate. This one was different. The drawings were older, the lines worn smooth. The images showed her people on land or in shallow water, structures that looked like the ruins I'd seen, and human figures approaching. Small at first, just a few. Then more. Then conflict, depicted in simple, violent strokes. She pointed at this slate, then at herself, then at the deep water beyond the boat. Then she made a gesture I'd seen before, one I associated with hiding or safety. Her people had fled, not because they were weak, not because they couldn't fight, but because fighting humans meant becoming like humans, violent, destructive. So they'd gone deep, where humans couldn't follow. But that wasn't the end of her message. She made another gesture, pointing at her eyes, then at me, then at the horizon. Watching. Her people watched us. They'd been watching for a long time. And what they'd seen hadn't changed their minds about the choice they'd made. She pulled out the newest slate, the one that hit me the hardest. The drawings showed boats like mine, nets. But these nets weren't just full of fish, they showed other things caught. Dolphins, seals, and her people. She pointed at the slate, then made a sound I'd learned meant now or current time. This wasn't ancient history, this was recent. Her people were still being caught in fishing nets, still being killed by human activity. Accidentally maybe, but that didn't matter. Dead was dead. I felt sick. I thought about the drift nets I'd seen other boats using. Miles-long nets that caught everything in their path. I thought about the stories I'd heard from other fishermen about strange catches they'd found and dumped overboard before anyone could see. I thought about what would happen if her people were discovered by scientists, by governments, by people who would see them as specimens or threats or resources. She'd shown me why they hid, not because they were afraid of being captured and studied, not because they were primitive and fearful, but because they'd watched us for millennia. They'd seen what we did to species we didn't understand. They'd seen what we did to our own kind when we disagreed. They'd seen our wars, our extinctions, our destruction of habitats we depended on. They'd made a choice: stay hidden and survive, or reveal themselves and risk becoming another casualty of human behavior. I tried to tell her that not all humans were like that some of us tried to protect, to preserve, to coexist. But how could I? I was a fisherman who made his living pulling tons of fish from the ocean every week. I'd seen the catches decline year after year as populations were depleted. I'd participated in exactly the kind of extraction she was showing me. She seemed to understand my conflict. She made a soft sound and touched my hand where it rested on the rail. Then she made a gesture that combined several meanings I'd learned. Different. You, not same. She was telling me I was different from the pattern she'd shown me, but one person being different didn't change the overall pattern. Over the next few months, she showed me more, not through drawings, but by bringing me to places where I could see the evidence directly. Fishing nets abandoned on the seafloor, still catching fish that would die trapped in the mesh. Debris fields where boats had dumped garbage, areas where the bottom was scarred by dragging trawl nets. And once, in September of 1979, she showed me something that made her message concrete. A body, one of her people, tangled in a ghost net, dead long enough that decomposition had started. Young, maybe half her size. She floated near the body, making sounds I'd never heard before, mourning sounds. She didn't untangle the body, she just stayed there, and I understood why she'd brought me. This was the cost. This was what human fishing did to her. People. Not often, maybe, but often enough that they'd learn to avoid our waters, to stay deep, to hide. I surfaced from that dive and sat in my boat for an hour, not moving. She stayed below with the body. When she finally surfaced, she looked at me and made a sound that seemed like a question. Did I understand now? Did I see why they couldn't reveal themselves? I understood. And the weight of that understanding has stayed with me every day since. By 1982, I'd been meeting with her for 8 years. I was 32 years old. My daughters were in school. I'd paid off the Mary Catherine and had started building modest savings. The fishing was harder, catches smaller, but I was experienced enough to find fish where others couldn't. But the ocean was changing. I saw it in the catches, in the types of fish I was finding, in the condition of the waters. More boats were working the grounds, bigger boats with more advanced equipment, trawlers from other states, from other countries, working our traditional fishing areas. The competition was getting fierce. In June of that year, I went out to our usual meeting spot and waited 3 hours before she surfaced. When she did, I saw immediately that something was wrong. Deep lacerations across her back, parallel lines about 3 inches apart. The wounds were fresh, maybe a day old, still seeping blood into the seawater. I grabbed my medical kit. Over the years, I'd started keeping supplies specifically for treating her. Antiseptic, bandages, antibiotics I'd gotten from a veterinarian friend who asked no questions. I gestured for her to come closer to the boat. She was in pain. I could see it in the way she moved, careful and slow. The wounds went from her left shoulder blade down to her lower back, right where her human anatomy transitioned to her tail, deep enough that I could see tissue underneath, propeller strikes. I'd seen them before on dolphins and seals. A boat had hit her, the propeller cutting as she tried to escape. She'd been lucky. If the blades had hit her head or severed her spine, she wouldn't have survived. I cleaned the wounds with antiseptic, trying to be gentle. She made sounds of pain but didn't pull away. I covered the deepest cuts with a waterproof adhesive bandage I'd learned worked in marine environments. For the others, I just cleaned them and let them bleed out naturally. Salt water was a decent antiseptic if the wounds weren't too deep. While I worked, she made sounds. Urgent sounds I hadn't heard before. Complex vocalizations that went on for several minutes. She was trying to tell me something important. I finished treating her wounds and tried to understand. She pointed at the injuries, then made a gesture for big, and mimicked the shape of a boat's hull with her hands. Large vessel. She pointed in the direction she'd come from, north and east. Then she made a gesture I'd learned meant many. Many large vessels. She continued. She pointed at herself, then made a sweeping gesture that I understood to mean her people, all of them. Then she pointed down into the deep water and made a gesture for moving or leaving. Her people were leaving the area. I understood the basics, but not the urgency. I'd seen the increase in boat traffic myself. But she kept making sounds, kept gesturing. She pulled out a slate, one she'd prepared. The drawings showed boats, many boats, with nets that extended deep. She drew lines showing the nets reaching depths I knew commercial boats couldn't fish, but she was telling me they would. They were trying to. Then she drew something else, her people, depicted in their usual way. But these figures were smaller, surrounded by others, young ones, children. She pointed at this drawing, then at the area around us, then made the leaving gesture again. The families were leaving. The young ones couldn't survive in waters with this much boat traffic. The risk of accidental death was too high. The noise from engines interfered with their communication. The nets, even when her people avoided them, created barriers in the water. She made the morning sound again, the one I'd heard when she showed me the body in the ghost net. Then she gestured around us, at the ocean, at the location where we'd been meeting for 8 years. She made a sound I'd learned meant finished or ended. She was saying goodbye, not to me specifically, but to these waters. Her people were relocating to deeper areas, further from shore, further from human activity. I tried to ask when. She held up her fingers, 3, then made a circular gesture I'd learned meant months or seasons, 3 months. By September, they'd be gone. I asked if I could follow, if I could find them in the deeper waters. She made a negative gesture. Then she pointed at my boat, then at the deep water, then made a sinking gesture. My boat couldn't handle the conditions where they were going, waters too rough, distances too far, and even if I could get there, she seemed to indicate it wouldn't be safe for either of us. She reached out and took my hand, something she rarely did anymore. She'd become more cautious over the years, more aware of the risk, but now she held my hand and made sounds, soft and sad. She looked at me with those large eyes, and I saw something in them I'd seen in my own daughter's eyes when they had to leave something behind they cared about. She stayed for another hour. We didn't try to communicate. We just existed in the same space, both of us understanding that this was changing, that the relationship we'd built was being disrupted by forces neither of us controlled. When she finally dove, she surfaced once more about 50 yards away. She made a sound, a long single note that carried across the water. Then she was gone. I went back every week for the rest of that summer. Sometimes she was there. More often she wasn't. When we did meet, it was brief. She was busy, I could tell. Her people were preparing for the migration. In late August, I saw them gathering. At least 20 of them, maybe more, at the edge of my visibility. Adults and young ones. The first time I'd seen the young ones up close. They were smaller, maybe 3 feet long, including their tails, with lighter coloring than the adults. They stayed close to their parents, hiding behind them when they noticed me watching. She was there too. She swam over to the boat one last time. She brought something with her, a piece of carved coral, deep red, about 6 inches long. The carving was intricate, showing patterns I couldn't interpret but recognized as deliberate art. She placed it in my hand and made the sound that meant, keep, remember. I tried to give her something in return, but I had nothing that seemed appropriate. Finally, I took off my watch, the waterproof one I wore every day. I'd had it since I was 18. It was nothing special, but it was something of mine. I handed it to her. She examined it carefully, fascinated by the moving hands. Then she made the approval sound and slipped it onto her wrist. It was too large, but she adjusted the strap until it stayed on. We looked at each other for a long moment. Then she made one more sound, different from any I'd heard. It was soft, almost musical. It felt like a blessing or a farewell. Then she dove and swam toward the others. I watched them leave. The group moved together, coordinated, heading northeast into deeper water. I watched until they were out of sight. Then I watched for another hour, hoping they might come back. They didn't. I didn't see her for 3 years. From September 1982 to September 1985, I fished the waters off Maine and never saw any of them. I'd go to the old coordinates sometimes just to check. The ruins were still there, but they felt empty, abandoned. Whatever presence had made that place significant was gone. I told myself they were fine. They'd relocated to safer waters, deeper areas where commercial boats couldn't reach them. They'd found places where their young could grow up without dodging propellers and nets. I told myself that our meetings had ended naturally, that the relationship had run its course. But I missed her. I missed the communication, the connection to something beyond my ordinary life. I missed understanding that the world was stranger and more wonderful than most people knew. In September 1985, I was fishing different grounds, further offshore, following smaller boats that had found productive areas. I was maybe 80 miles out, closer to the continental shelf than I usually worked. The water was deeper here, several hundred feet. I was hauling nets when I heard a sound, faint but recognizable. the low resonant note that meant greeting. I cut the engine and went to the rail. She surfaced 40 yards away, just her head above water, watching me. I couldn't believe she'd found me, 80 miles from our old meeting place, in waters I'd never worked before. But she'd found me. I waved. She swam closer, and as she approached, I saw the changes. She was older. The skin around her eyes had lines I hadn't noticed before. Her movements were slower, more careful. 3 years wasn't long in human terms, but I didn't know how long her people lived, what 3 years meant to them. She came alongside the boat and rested her arms on the rail. The watch I'd given her was still on her wrist. It had stopped working long ago, but she'd kept it. I reached out and touched it, and she made a soft sound. Memory, recognition. We spent the next 2 hours together, not communicating much, just existing in each other's presence. She seemed tired. She'd gesture toward the depth, toward where her people now lived, and I understood she'd come a long way to find me. I tried to ask questions through our old system of gestures. Were her people safe? Were the young ones growing? Had they found good waters? She made positive gestures for most of it, but there was hesitation. Things were different. Harder, maybe. The deep waters were safer from humans, but that came with other challenges. She dove once and brought back something to show me, a shell, but from a depth I couldn't reach. It was white and delicate, nothing like the shells from shallow waters. She held it up, showing me evidence of where her people now lived. Then she made a gesture toward the darkness below, and a sound that conveyed vastness. They'd gone deep, very deep. As the afternoon wore on, I realized this was goodbye. Not the uncertain goodbye of 3 years ago, but a final one. She was older. The journey here had been difficult. She wouldn't make it again. Around 4 in the afternoon, she made a gesture I should come closer to the rail. I leaned over, and she reached into a pouch I'd seen her carry before, made from some kind of plant fiber. She pulled out the piece of carved coral, the one she'd given me 3 years earlier. I'd kept it in a waterproof container on the boat, checking it occasionally to make sure it was still safe. She made a negative gesture when I started to get it. No, she had something different. She pulled out another piece of coral, different from the first. This one was white, not red, and the carving was more elaborate. It showed figures, her people, with symbols above them I couldn't read. She held it carefully, and I understood this was important to her. She placed it in my hand and closed my fingers around it. Then she made the keep gesture, emphatic. This wasn't just a memento. This was something significant. A piece of her culture, her history. She was trusting me with it. I tried to speak, to tell her what knowing her had meant, how she'd changed my understanding of the world. But she couldn't understand words, and we didn't have gestures for concepts that abstract. Instead, I put my hand over my heart, then reached out and put it over hers. She understood. She made a sound, that soft, musical note from our last meeting, and put her hand over mine. We stayed like that for maybe 30 seconds. Then she pulled away and dove. She surfaced once more, about 60 yards away, and made the greeting sound one last time. Then she went under and didn't resurface. I waited until dark, hoping she'd come back. She didn't. I started the engine and pointed the boat toward home. I held the carved coral in my hand the entire 3-hour trip back to port. Chapter 10. Why I'm Speaking Now. For 39 years, I've kept that piece of carved coral locked in a safe in my basement. I never showed it to anyone. Not my wife, not my daughters, not the grandchildren who came later. It was evidence of something I couldn't prove, testimony to experiences I couldn't share. I kept the other artifacts too, the pottery shard from the ruins, the stone with symbols I couldn't read, my notebooks, all 12 of them, filled with observations and drawings and attempts to document a relationship that shouldn't have existed. I kept them hidden because I knew what would happen if I revealed them. Scientists would demand proof. They'd want to go to the ruins to bring up artifacts, to study and document everything. Even if their intentions were good, the attention would bring others. Trophy hunters, curiosity seekers, governments with their own agendas. The waters where she and I had met for 8 years would be flooded with boats and divers and equipment. And if her people still visited the ruins occasionally, still used those waters for reasons I didn't understand, they'd be found. And once found, they'd be pursued, studied, maybe captured. Best case, they'd be protected under some Endangered Species Act that would fence off huge areas of ocean and bring exactly the kind of attention they'd spent millennia avoiding. So I stayed silent. I went back to being Robert Callahan, commercial fisherman. I watched my daughters grow up and have children of their own. I retired in 2014 at age 64, sold the Mary Catherine to a young guy who reminded me of myself at that age. I moved inland, away from the water, and tried to build a life that had nothing to do with the ocean, but I never forgot. Every night I'd open the safe and look at the carved coral. I'd trace the patterns with my finger and remember her eyes, her hands, the sounds she made. I'd remember that the world held more than most people knew, and I'd wonder if her people were still out there, still watching us from the depths. 6 months ago, I started having symptoms: fatigue, loss of appetite, pain in my abdomen. The doctors ran tests. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. It had metastasized to my liver. They gave me chemotherapy options that might extend my life a few months. I declined. I've lived 71 years. That's enough. The diagnosis changed things. Once you know your time is limited, your priorities clarify. What had seemed important before, protecting the secret, avoiding mockery or disbelief, stopped mattering. What became important was the truth. I'm telling this story now because I'm dying and because I believe the world needs to know. Not so scientists can find her people, not so governments can add them to lists or create protected areas, but so people understand that we share this planet with intelligences we don't recognize, and that our behavior affects them in ways we never consider. Her people made a choice to hide from us, not because they were primitive or fearful, but because they'd watched us for thousands of years. They'd seen our wars, our extinctions, our casual destruction of habitats and species. They'd seen what we do to anything different from ourselves. And they'd decided that survival meant staying hidden. I don't know if they're still in the North Atlantic. I don't know if the ones I met are still alive. But somewhere in the deep ocean, they're out there, still watching us, still hoping, maybe, that one day we'll prove them wrong about what kind of species we are. I'm leaving the carved coral to my oldest granddaughter, Emma. She's named after my first daughter, and she's studying marine biology. I'm writing this account and putting it with the coral in my will. When she receives it, she can decide what to do with the information. Maybe she'll dismiss it as the delusions of a dying old man. Maybe she'll believe it and try to find them. Maybe she'll do what I did and keep the secret, protecting them from us. I hope she chooses to protect them. They've survived this long by staying hidden. They don't need to be discovered. They don't need our protection or our study. They just need us to be better than we've been, to fish sustainably, to clean our oceans, to stop destroying the habitats we share with other intelligences. That's what she tried to tell me in those 8 years we spent together. She wasn't asking for help. She was showing me what we were doing, hoping I'd understand, hoping that one human understanding might somehow make a difference. I'm 71 years old. I have maybe 6 months left. I've kept this secret for nearly 50 years, and now I'm breaking that silence. Not because I need anyone to believe me, not because I want attention or validation, but because somewhere in the deep ocean, they're still there, still watching, still waiting to see if we can be better than our history suggests. I hope we can be, for their sake and for ours.